Now this next row is where the magic happens. We are going to be dropping all these top loops. So go ahead and now take them off the peg. I'm gonna do 5 pegs at a time. So I have the first, second, third, fourth, then fifth, right there. Now with your knitting tool, grab your working yarn and leave about 1.5 inches of the working yarn. Now you are going to tug on each of the loops so each loop becomes elongated. Perfect, just like that. Alright, now with this next step, just take it nice and slow. You're going to leave the first loop on the peg. Now you're going to move the second loop over to the first peg. Now the third loop over to that first peg. The fourth loop over to that first peg. And the fifth loop over to that first peg. Perfect. So you can see you have the first peg with 5 loops, then peg 2, 3, 4, 5 are empty. This part right here is this portion of our stitch right there. Now we're going to create these stitches that are sitting on those elongated loops. Okay, let's go ahead and let's show you how to do this. I am going to zoom out so you can have more room to see. Now these 5 loops, we are going to open them up and make them go on over the second, the third, and if you can, the fourth peg, just like that. Perfect. So here we go, we have the 5 strands on those 4 first pegs. Now I want you to move this over one spot. Perfect. Now I want you to cover the 5th peg. Good job. Alright, so now we start. Knit the first peg. Place that loop that you created on the emptieth peg. Great job. Now I need you to empty that next peg so that we can put the next loop that we create onto that next peg. Bring the working yarn behind that empty peg to the front, to the base of the loom to create a purl stitch. Place that stitch on the empty peg. Now pop the working yarns, not the working yarns, the strands off the peg to create that empty peg. Bring the working yarn behind that empty peg, and now we're gonna knit. Perfect. Knit. Place that knit on the empty peg. Job. Now this next one we need an empty peg, so pop it off, working yarn behind. This next one is a purl. Place that purl on the empty peg. Perfect. Now the last one, bring the working yarn to the top of the last peg. Knit it. Hold on to that loop that you created and pop all the strands off the peg. Perfect. The first crown has been created. Let's do that again. Let me zoom in for you. Perfect. First step, we're gonna drop all the strands. 2, 3, 4 from 5 pegs. So here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now elongate them. Perfect. Great job. Now again we're gonna move them from second to first, from third to first, fourth to first, from fifth to first. Great job. Now grab them all and put them all on the second peg. Perfect work. Now we're gonna elongate them from the second peg all the way to the fifth peg. Ready? Grab them, tug on them so they elongate. Good job. Now bring your working yarn from that fifth peg, from the first 5 stitches behind the empty peg into the front of the next crown. The first stitch is a knit stitch, so let's go ahead and create a knit stitch. Place that loop onto the empty peg. Now we need to create an empty peg for our next stitch, so pop the strands off behind the peg, bring the working yarn behind the empty peg to the front and to the base of the loom, because we need a knit stitch, a purl stitch. Put that purl stitch on the empty peg, pop the strands off to create the empty peg we need next, behind to the front to create a knit stitch. Place it on the empty peg. Now pop the strands behind, bring the working yarn behind the empty peg and to the front. Next one we're gonna purl, place it, and for the last one we're gonna knit, so bring it to the front, hold on to the loop, pop all the stitches off. Good job. Just like that. Right there we created our second crown. Okay, time for the third crown. Pop the loops off. 2, 3, 4, 5. Perfect. Now bring from the second to the first, the third to the first, the fourth to the first, and from the fifth to the first. Now that you have them all on that first peg, grab them all together and place them on the second peg so that we can have an empty peg to place our first stitch. Okay, perfect. Again, now we're gonna elongate those 5 stitches from that second peg all the way to the fifth peg. So go ahead. One of these ones is not perfect right there. Alright, let's do that again. We need to create 5 stitches, a knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, and a knit 1. Perfect. So first the knit 1, working yarn behind the peg, behind the empty peg. There it is. Place it on the empty peg. Brilliant. Okay, pop them off. Perfect. Bring the working yarn behind the empty peg to the base of the knitting loom to create a purl stitch. Place that purl stitch on the empty peg. Pop the strands off. Perfect. Bring it behind the empty peg to the front to create a knit stitch. Place that knit stitch on the empty peg. Pop the strands off. Now bring the working yarn behind the empty peg to the front. The next one is a purl stitch. So there it is. Place it on the empty peg, and for our last stitch, a knit stitch on that fifth peg. Put the working yarn on top, hook it with the knitting tool. Perfect. Hold on to that loop. Now pop all those strands off the peg, placing our loop on the peg. Tug on the working yarn. Perfect. Okay, for our last one, this is it. Ready? Pop, 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 pop. Perfect. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Perfect. Now we're gonna move from the second to the first, from the third to the first, fourth, the first, fifth to the first. Great job. Now we need that empty peg, so move them from the first peg over to the second peg. Beautiful. Now we're gonna extend these 5 stitches all the way over. Let's see, have them all. Yep. There are 3 pegs. Let's see if we can make it to 4. No, let's just make it to 3 on this last one, so I can show you if in case you can't extend them all the way. Okay, so bring the working yarn behind the empty peg to the front, create that knit stitch that you need to create. Perfect. Place that loop on the empty peg. Now I'm gonna pop this off to create the empty peg. Remember, only 1 empty peg we need. Bring it to the bottom to create the purl stitch. 2. Now pop it off. 3. Bring the working yarn behind into the front to create our knit stitch. Place it on the empty peg. Now here, instead of popping it off, you are going to move them over 1 spot. Perfect. Next one is a purl stitch. Place it on the empty peg, and for the last one, a knit stitch. Perfect. Now grab the loop, pop it off, place the loop on. Great job. Now for this next step, make sure that you have 20 stitches on the loom. So go ahead and count 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. Great job. You have just completed your first crowns. So what we did is we placed that first row right here, that first row of stitches. So the next step is knitting 6 rows of garter stitch. 6 rows. So you will do, and you will have 3 garter stitch ridges. 1, 2, 3. I have reached the end of my 6th row, and I am ready once again to create the crowns. If you want to stick with me, please go ahead. So again, we're gonna knit 1, we knit the next one, then we're gonna ewrap that peg counterclockwise 3 times. 1, 2, 3. Continue on all the way to the end, knitting the peg and then ewrapping the peg 3 times. Go ahead, do that part. We already seen this and it's pretty simple. And all you do for the stitch pattern is keep repeating the 6 rows of garter stitch, so that will give you 3 garter stitch ridges. 1, 2, 3. And then you repeat 1 more row of crowns, then 6 rows of garter stitch, 1 more row of crowns. Then when you are done, you will only do 4 rows of garter stitch, which means you will end up with 2 rows of garter stitch ridges. So 2 ridges, 1, 2. Alright, I hope you have liked practicing this stitch with me. Again, it is called a crown stitch. There's a crown 1 and a crown 2. This is a crown 1 stitch. Let's flip our loom over and see if we can take a look at how it is looking. Oh yeah, it's looking perfect. Look at that. Can you see those little crowns? Great job. Alright, well, we'll see you next time, and thank you for joining me.